Montana, February 1949. The kind of winter that makes old ranchers go quiet. The kind that teaches you respect before sunrise. Across the high plains, smoke rose thin from every chimney. Woodpiles shrinking, cattle huddling, men watching the sky like it held a verdict. But in the low hills west of Miles City, something was different. A widow's homestead with no smoke at all. Neighbors driving past slowed down, squinted through the frost on their windshields, wondering if Martha Gaines had finally given up and headed to her sister's place in Billings. The barn looked abandoned. The fields lay buried. No tracks in the snow. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see from the road, was that Martha was warmer than any of them, because tucked inside that weathered barn, invisible to passing eyes, sat a curved metal shelter that would rewrite the rules of frontier survival. A solution so simple it seemed stupid, so effective it would shame every expert who mocked it. This is the story of how one woman's desperate improvisation became the blueprint that saved lives across 3 states. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now, because every single week I bring you real survival wisdom that actually worked when people's lives depended on it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know who else understands that the old ways weren't backwards, they were tested by blood and ice. Now, let's talk about what Martha understood that the rest of Montana was about to learn the hard way. Martha Gaines wasn't supposed to be running a homestead alone. The plan had been simple. She and her husband Robert would work the 160 acres together, raise cattle, build something for their daughters. Standard Montana dream. Standard Montana struggle. Then in August 1947, a tractor rollover took Robert in an instant. No warning. No second chance. Just a widow at 32 with 2 girls under 10 and a ranch that ate money faster than she could earn it. The neighbors offered help, of course. Casseroles, prayers, advice. Some of it useful, most of it wrapped in the unspoken assumption that she'd sell by spring and move somewhere sensible. Somewhere a woman alone could manage. Martha had different ideas. She kept the cattle, kept the land, learned to run fence and fix machinery, and do the work of 2 people on the strength of 1. It wasn't pride, it was mathematics. Selling meant losing everything Robert had died building. Staying meant freezing or starving or both. The first winter after his death, she learned exactly how brutal that equation could be. The main cabin was solid enough. Robert had built it himself in 1944, following the standard ranch pattern. Timber frame, board siding, tar paper beneath, a good iron stove in the center. It worked, but it worked the way every cabin worked out here. You fed it wood constantly, or you froze. Martha burned through 4 cords that winter. For cords she had to cut, split, haul, and stack herself. For cords that cost money she didn't have and time she couldn't spare. The girls slept in layers. Ice formed on the inside of the windows every night. By March, her hands were so cracked from the cold and the wood that they bled when she made fists. She knew she couldn't do it again. But the real problem wasn't just the cold. It was the wind. Montana wind doesn't ask permission. It comes off the Rockies like a freight train with a grudge, finds every gap in your walls, every crack in your door frame, and pulls the heat right out of your house. Doesn't matter how much wood you burn if the wind steals it faster than the stove can replace it. Robert used to joke that Montana had 2 seasons, wind and more wind. Martha wasn't laughing anymore. By summer of 1948, she was facing a choice. She could sell. She could remarry some rancher who'd take the land and maybe tolerate the girls. Or she could figure out how to survive another winter without killing herself in the process. Then in late July, a traveling supplier stopped by selling war surplus. Quonset huts, half-cylinder steel shelters, 20 feet wide, waterproof, wind-resistant, designed for military bases in the Pacific. The supplier had a dozen of them rusting on a lot in Billings. Cheap, ugly, built for temporary housing, not Montana winters. Make a decent storage shed, he said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Keep hay dry. Tools. Whatever. Martha looked at the curved metal walls, the simple bolt-together design, the way the whole structure could shed snow and wind without a single joint to leak. She thought about her cabin. She thought about the 4 cords of wood. She thought about her daughters sleeping in coats. And then she had an idea so strange she almost didn't say it out loud. What if I put it inside the barn? The supplier blinked. Ma'am, the barn's got walls. Roof's solid. No wind gets through. If I set this up inside, double layer. Air gap between them. Would that work? He scratched his jaw, looked at her like she'd suggested building a house underwater. I mean, I guess you could, but that's a whole lot of work for a storage shed. I'm not talking about storage, Martha said quietly. She bought it that afternoon. Paid cash from emergency fund Robert had hidden in a coffee can. Didn't tell the neighbors. Didn't ask permission. Just started building. The barn had been standing since 1938. Solid lodgepole pine frame, board and batten siding. A gambrel roof that had survived a decade of Montana weather without complaint. Robert had used it for cattle in winter, equipment in summer. It was 24 feet wide, 32 feet deep, with good bones and no leaks. Martha cleaned it out completely, swept the dirt floor, moved every tool, every bale, every piece of machinery into a borrowed shed, stood in the empty space and measured. The Quonset hut was 20 feet wide at the base, 48 feet long when fully assembled. It would fit with 2 feet of clearance on each side, 4 feet from the barn's back wall. Plenty of room at the front for the door. She started assembling on August 15, 1948. The kit came with instructions printed in cheerful military optimism. For men can assemble in one weekend. Martha had herself, her 12-year-old daughter Eleanor, and a borrowed come-along. It took 3 weeks. Bolt by bolt, rib by rib, she built the curved steel skeleton inside the barn's wooden embrace. Each rib was a semicircular arch, corrugated metal bolted to a steel frame. The whole thing designed to be light enough to ship and strong enough to ignore typhoons. The ribs went up every 2 feet, locked together with horizontal straps, the seams sealed with tar paper and metal flashing. By September, she had a 20-foot wide tunnel of ribbed steel sitting inside a 24-foot wide barn, with a 2-foot air gap running down both sides like a thermal moat. That gap was everything. The barn walls blocked the wind completely. No gaps, no joints, no places for that brutal Montana gale to knife through and steal heat. The Quonset hut's steel skin sat in perfectly still air, protected on all sides, insulated by the simple fact that wind can't rob heat for what it can't touch. Physics doesn't care about intentions. It just works. Martha sealed both ends of the Quonset hut with plywood and tar paper, cut a door in the front, and installed a small iron stove near the center. Not a big rancher stove, not some massive firebox, just a basic box stove with a 6-inch pipe running up through the barn roof. Then she insulated the inside. Wool blankets, quilts, old curtains, feed sacks stuffed with straw. She hung them from wires along the curved walls, creating a third layer of dead air between the steel and the living space. Every textile she could find went up, turning the inside of the hut into something that looked more like a grandmother's attic than military surplus. Eleanor asked if they were really going to live in there. "We're going to try," Martha said. "Worst case, we move back to the cabin." She moved her daughters in on October 1st. 2 cots, a table, 3 chairs, a wash basin, the stove, a wood box that held maybe a quarter of what the cabin used to need. That first night, Martha lit the stove at dusk with a handful of kindling and 4 small logs. The space heated in 20 minutes. She kept the fire going low, barely a flicker. Checked the temperature with a thermometer Robert had used for calving season. 58 degrees at 10 o'clock. 55 by midnight. She added 2 more logs and went to sleep. Woke up at dawn. The fire had died to coals. The thermometer read 52 degrees. In the cabin, when the fire died, the temperature would drop into the 30s within 2 hours. Here, the triple-layer system, barn walls, air gap, insulated hut, held the heat like a jar holds honey. Slow, steady, refusing to let it escape. Martha did the math in her head. 4 logs instead of 20. 1 fire instead of 3. A space that stayed warm enough to sleep in even when the fire went out. She looked at her daughters, still asleep under blankets that didn't need to be piled 6 deep. Looked at the curved steel walls with their patchwork insulation. Looked at the barn around it, standing guard against the wind. Then she smiled for the first time since Robert died. Word got around fast. Small towns don't keep secrets, and a widow moving into her barn qualified as gossip gold. By mid-October, half of Custer County knew Martha Gaines was living in some kind of metal shed tucked inside her livestock barn, and the other half was hearing about it. The reactions weren't kind. At the feed store in Miles City, men talked while loading sacks. Heard she's got that war surplus junk set up like a house. Steel tube thing. Looks like something you'd keep chickens in. Can't be warm. Metal don't hold heat. Hell, metal pulls heat right out. She's gonna freeze worse than if she stayed in the cabin. A few of them drove out to see for themselves, slowing down as they passed her property, craning their necks to peer at the barn. From the road, it looked exactly like it always had. Same weatherboards. Same gambrel roof. No smoke from a chimney because the stovepipe was tucked against the barn's backside, barely visible. One rancher, Dale Hutchins, stopped by on the pretense of checking if she needed help with cattle. He was 60, built like a boulder, and ran one of the most successful operations in the county. People listened when Dale talked. He stood outside the barn door, hat in his hands, trying to be polite. "Martha, I don't mean to pry, but folks are saying you moved into the barn." "That's right. Into that metal shed you bought. Quonset hut." "And yes." Dale shifted his weight, looked at the ground. "I'm sure you had your reasons, but that's not really a home, is it? That's storage. Maybe a workshop, not a place to raise girls." Martha kept her voice level. "It's warm. It's dry. It's cheaper to heat than the cabin. Cheaper now, maybe, but come real winter, steel freezes. Martha, you're going to be colder than you've ever been, and you're going to burn through it trying to fix it. That's not how you build for Montana." "I appreciate your concern, Dale. I'm not trying to tell you your business," he continued, though that's exactly what he was doing. "But I built 3 barns and 2 houses out here. I know how heat works. You need mass. You need thick walls. You can't fight winter with a tin can." He wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed he was helping. But his words carried weight, and when Dale Hutchins said something didn't work, people believed him. After he left, the gossip got sharper. At church, women whispered about that poor woman trying to make do. At the schoolhouse, when Eleanor showed up for class, kids asked if she really lived in a chicken coop now. One boy called it the Soupkin House, and the name stuck. The hardware store owner, when Martha came in for stove parts, shook his head. "I'll sell you what you need, but you're wasting your money. You ought to winterize the cabin proper. That's what your husband would have wanted." Martha didn't argue, didn't defend herself, just paid, loaded her truck, and drove home. But it bothered her daughters. Eleanor came home one afternoon in early November, face red with more than just cold. "Jimmy Parsons said we live in a shed like hobos. Said his dad, said you don't know what you're doing." Martha was stitching a quilt panel to hang as extra insulation. She didn't look up. "Jimmy Parsons' dad burns 6 cords of wood every winter and still has ice on his windows every morning. I'll take his advice when he figures out how to stay warm. But everybody thinks it's stupid." "Everybody thought the Wright brothers were stupid too," Martha said quietly. "Right up until they flew." Eleanor wasn't convinced. Neither was her younger sister Ruth, who asked that night if they were going to be warm enough when the real cold came. "We will," Martha promised. She didn't know if she was lying. The storm came out of Alberta like a judgment. Weather forecasts in 1949 weren't what they'd become. The radio said cold front expected, which in Montana could mean anything from a pleasant chill to the end of the world. Nobody knew this was going to be the worst blizzard in 20 years. It started on February 9th with clouds the color of old iron and a wind that dropped the temperature 15 degrees in an hour. By evening, snow was falling so thick you couldn't see the fence post from a porch. By midnight, the wind was screaming. Martha woke at 2 in the morning to a sound like the barn was tearing apart. She pulled on boots and a coat, stepped out of the Quonset hut into the barn's interior. The building groaned and flexed, timbers creaking, but held. Outside, through the gaps in the board siding, she could see nothing but white chaos. The thermometer on the barn wall read 8 degrees. Inside the Quonset hut, it was 56. She added 2 logs to the stove, checked on her daughters, both asleep, both warm, and went back to bed. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of wind that never stopped, snow that buried fences and filled in roads, cold that killed cattle standing up. In Miles City, the temperature dropped to 18 below. Out on the ranches, it went lower. Dale Hutchins later said his thermometer hit 22 below on the second night, and that was inside his barn. The town basically shut down. Roads became impassable. The snowplows couldn't keep up. Families huddled in their homes, feeding their stoves every 2 hours, burning through wood at a desperate rate. Martha checked her woodpile on the morning of the third day. She'd used 11 logs total. 11 logs in 3 days of the worst weather Montana had seen in 2 decades. She let the fire die completely that afternoon, just to test. Watch the thermometer inside the hut. It dropped from 61 degrees to 52 over 6 hours, then stabilized. The triple-layer insulation, barn walls blocking wind, air gap creating a dead zone, fabric insulation trapping heat, turned the space into a thermal battery that released warmth slowly, evenly, refusing to give it up to the screaming cold outside. When the fire was going, the hut heated fast and stayed comfortable. When it died, the temperature dropped slowly enough that they could sleep through the night without freezing. Eleanor woke up on the 4th morning and asked, "Why isn't it cold?" Martha was sitting at the table, drinking coffee, watching snow blow past the gaps in the barn siding like horizontal rain. "Because we built it right," she said simply. The storm broke on February 13th. The wind stopped. The sun came out. The temperature climbed back to a brutal but manageable 12 degrees. And across Custer County, people started counting the cost. Stay with me, because what happened next proved every single skeptic wrong. The numbers don't lie, and when the neighbors saw them, they couldn't believe what this chicken coop had just survived. Hit that like button right now if you want to see how badly the experts got humbled. Dale Hutchins was the first to show up. He drove out on February 15th, 2 days after the storm cleared, ostensibly to check if Martha needed help digging out. His truck crunched through snow that was still 3 feet deep in the drifts, and when he stepped out, his face had the kind of exhaustion that comes from not sleeping right for a week. Martha was outside, splitting kindling. Not much, just enough to keep a small fire going. Dale looked at her, looked at the barn, looked at the modest pile of split wood by the door. "You make it through all right?" "We did." "You." He rubbed his face with one gloved hand. "Lost 4 head of cattle. Spent every waking hour keeping the house warm enough that the pipes didn't freeze. Went through 1.5 cords of wood in 4 days. My back's killing me, and I'm too damn old for this." Martha nodded sympathetically, but didn't say anything. Dale glanced at her woodpile again. "How much did you burn?" "Not much." "Martha." His voice was gentle but insistent. "How much?" She set down the axe. "Maybe 20 logs. Total." Dale stared at her. 20 logs in 4 days? That's not possible." "It's possible. It happened." "Ow!" She gestured to the barn. "Want to see?" He followed her inside, stepping from brutal February sunlight into the dim interior. The barn was cold, maybe 20 degrees, but still. No wind. The Quonset hut sat in the center like a silver egg, frost on the outside of the curved metal, condensation frozen in delicate patterns. Martha opened the plywood door. The air that spilled out was warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, just warm, like stepping into a spring house in March. Dale stepped inside and stopped, looked at the curved walls draped in quilts and blankets, looked at the small stove with barely a flicker of flame, looked at the thermometer hanging from a wire. 63 degrees. He touched the wall, felt the fabric, the air gap behind it, the steel beyond that. Stepped back outside into the barn and felt the dead air between the barn boards and the hut. Walked around the entire structure, studying the gaps, the spacing, the way the barn's walls stood guard against the wind while the hut sat protected in the center. When he came back in, his expression had changed. You build a house inside a house. More or less. The barn blocks the wind. The air gap insulates. The hut holds the heat. That's right. Dale sat down heavily on one of the wooden chairs. "I burned 36 times more wood than you did. My house is bigger, sure, but not that much bigger. And I was cold every night." He looked at Martha with something between respect and disbelief. "How warm did it get in here during the day?" "With the stove going steady, about 70. At night, when we let it die down, low 50s. Low 50s. With no fire. The heat stays in. That's the whole point. Dale was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that would change everything. How much would it cost to do this? Martha had already done the math. The Quonset hut was $40. Ceiling and insulation, maybe another 10. You need a barn or a shed to put it in, but most folks already have that. Call it $50 total if you've got the structure. Less than half a cord of wood for the whole winter instead of 6 or 7. You'd make your money back in one season. Dale stood up, walked outside, looked at his truck, looked back at the barn. Then he asked if she'd mind if he told people. Tell them whatever you want, Martha said. I'm not selling anything. I'm just trying to stay warm. The next visitor came 2 days later. Then another. Then 5 in one afternoon. By the end of February, every rancher within 30 miles had heard about the widow who heated her home with 20 logs during the worst blizzard in memory. Some came skeptical. Some came desperate. All of them left thinking. A rancher named Eugene Fletcher asked if the military sold Quonset huts in different sizes. A farmer named John Yates wanted to know if you could use a granary instead of a barn. A young couple, the Andersons, asked if Martha would walk them through the whole process step by step. She did. Every time, explaining the air gap, the dead wind zone, the thermal mass, the slow release of trapped heat. She wasn't a teacher, wasn't an engineer, just a woman who'd figured out how to survive and was willing to share. The hardware store in Miles City started carrying Quonset huts by March. The supplier who'd sold Martha hers came back with a whole truck full, saying he'd never seen demand like this. Whatever you did, ma'am, you started something. By April, 3 families had built versions of Martha's design. By the next winter, 17 homesteads within 50 miles had some variation. Quonset huts in barns, metal sheds in granaries, double-wall construction with air gaps and insulation. The idea is spread like a grass fire, jumping from ranch to ranch, adapted and modified, but always built on the same principle. Protect your living space from the wind, trap the heat with layers, and let physics do the work. Dale Hutchins built his own version that summer. Used a military surplus Quonset hut inside his old cattle barn, insulated with wool and canvas, added a small wood stove. He invited Martha to the inaugural fire in October. Lit it an hour ago, he said, showing her inside. It's already warmer than my house ever got. He stood there in his own creation, a rancher who'd built structures his whole life, learning something new from a widow he'd dismissed as foolish. I'm sorry, he said finally, for what I said before. Martha smiled. You didn't know. None of us did. That's the whole point of trying new things. That winter was milder, but it didn't matter. The people who'd built Martha's system used a fraction of the wood their neighbors burned, stayed warmer, worked less, and every one of them told someone else. By 1952, the barn hut method was standard practice across eastern Montana. By 1955, variations had spread to Wyoming and the Dakotas. The military even started using double-wall construction for cold weather bases, though they never acknowledged where the idea came from. Martha Gaines never patented it, never profited, just kept living in her Quonset hut inside the barn, raising her daughters, running her ranch, and heating her home with a wood pile that most people would burn through in a week. When a journalist from the Billings Gazette came to interview her in 1956, he asked what made her think of it. Desperation, she said, and a little bit of luck. But mostly I just refused to believe that freezing was the only option. The article ran with the headline, Widows War Surplus Shelter Outsmarted Montana Winter. Martha kept the clipping in a drawer, never showed it to anyone, never brought it up. She didn't need validation from newspapers. The warm house was enough. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in quiet moments. A rancher standing in Martha's barn on a January afternoon, feeling warm air on his face while a blizzard hammered the walls outside. A farmer's wife doing laundry in February without her hands going numb. A young homesteader realizing he could afford to stay on his land because he wasn't burning through his savings on firewood. These weren't dramatic conversions. No one stood up in church and declared Martha a genius. No town meeting voted to adopt her method as official policy. It spread the way real solutions always spread, through whispered conversations, practical results, and the quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the person everyone had dismissed actually knew something the rest of them didn't. By the spring of 1950, the mockery had stopped completely. The feed store in Miles City became an informal gathering place for people building their own versions. Men who'd laughed at the soup can house a year earlier now stood around comparing insulation techniques, debating whether wool worked better than canvas, sharing tips on sealing air gaps and positioning stoves. Dale Hutchins became an unlikely evangelist. He'd tell anyone who'd listen about his wood consumption dropping from 7 cords to 1.5. I was burning money, he'd say, shaking his head. Literally feeding my savings into a stove and watching it go up the chimney. Martha showed us there was another way. The hardware store owner who told Martha she was wasting her money started keeping a notebook behind the counter. Customers would come in asking about Quonset huts, and he'd flip through pages of hand-drawn diagrams and measurements that people had shared. Martha's method became shorthand for the whole approach. Protected structure, air gap, layered insulation, small efficient stove. Some people modified it. Eugene Fletcher built his inside a granary with double-thick walls, creating an even larger air gap. The Andersons used an old chicken coop as the outer shell, which everyone admitted was ironic given what they called Martha's setup. A rancher named Paul Dietrich combined the concept with a root cellar, building a semi-underground Quonset hut with earth banking on 3 sides. Every variation worked. Every single one. Because the physics didn't care about the details. Wind blocked is wind blocked. Heat trapped is heat trapped. Mass thermal storage is mass thermal storage. You could build it a dozen different ways, and as long as you understood the principles, it would keep you warm for a fraction of the cost. By 1951, the local newspaper ran a small feature. Area homesteads adopt efficient heating methods. The article interviewed 6 families, all using some version of Martha's double-wall approach. None of them mention her by name in the article. The reporter hadn't made the connection, but everyone who read it knew exactly where the idea had started. Martha's daughters grew up warm. Eleanor graduated high school in 1954 and went to college in Bozeman. Ruth followed 3 years later. Both of them would later say they never appreciated what their mother had done until they lived in regular houses and realized how much more work it took to stay comfortable. The homestead stayed in the family. Martha ran it until 1968, when she finally sold the cattle and leased the land. She kept the barn, though, kept the Quonset hut, lived there until 1982, heating her home with what she could carry in one hand, staying warmer than neighbors who burned cords. She outlived Dale Hutchins, Eugene Fletcher, and most of the people who'd mocked her. Outlived the skepticism, the judgment, the certainty that a widow couldn't possibly know more about survival than experienced ranchers. In 1979, a graduate student from Montana State University came to interview her for a thesis on vernacular architecture in extreme climates. He brought a camera, a tape recorder, and a long list of technical questions about thermodynamics and insulation coefficients. Martha, 73 years old and sharp as ever, listened to his questions and then asked one of her own. "You want to know why it works?" "Yes, ma'am." "The engineering principles, the heat transfer calculations, it works." Martha interrupted gently because I was cold and I couldn't afford to stay that way. "Everything else is just details." The student blinked. But the thermal mass, the convection barriers, though I didn't know those words in 1948. I just knew that wind steals heat, walls block wind, and air doesn't move heat as fast as air that's moving. So I made the air stop moving. She stood up, walked to the Quonset hut door, and gestured for him to follow. Inside, the space looked almost exactly as it had 30 years earlier. Same curved walls, same patchwork of insulation, though some of the quilts had been replaced over the years. Same small stove, though she'd upgraded to a more efficient model in the 60s. The thermometer hanging from the ceiling read 68 degrees. Outside, it was 15 degrees and snowing. "How many logs today?" the student asked, notebook ready. 3 this morning. "I'll add 2 tonight. That'll take me through tomorrow breakfast." He did the math in his head. 5 logs for 36 hours of heating in mid-November, Montana. His own apartment in Bozeman, with modern insulation and a gas furnace, cost him $60 a month to heat. Martha's system cost her maybe $20 for the entire winter. This should be standard, he said finally. Every cold climate house should use these principles. Martha smiled. Maybe, but people don't usually change until they have to. I had to. Most folks just turn up the heat and pay the bill. The thesis was published in 1980. It included detailed thermal analysis, airflow diagrams, and calculations proving that Martha's intuitive design matched what modern engineering would recommend. The students sent her a copy. She thanked him politely and put it on a shelf. She didn't need a thesis to tell her it worked. She'd been warm for 32 years. The technique continued spreading long after Martha stopped talking about it. In the 1980s, survivalist and off-grid communities rediscovered the barn hut method independently, calling it protected architecture and writing enthusiastic articles about how well it worked. They thought they'd invented something new. In the 1990s, a builder in Wyoming started offering thermal envelope systems for ranch houses using double-wall construction with air gaps and high-mass insulation. He charged premium prices and won awards. He had no idea a widow in Montana had done the same thing with war surplus and determination 50 years earlier. By the 2000s, the principle was so embedded in cold climate building that people forgot it had ever been controversial. Passive house design, thermal mass, wind barriers, air gaps, all standard practice. All things Martha Gaines figured out in a barn in 1948 because the alternative was freezing. She passed away in 1983, a week after her 87th birthday. The obituary in the Miles City paper was brief. Martha Gaines, longtime area rancher, survived by 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. It didn't mention the Quonset hut. Didn't mention the blizzard of '49. Didn't mention that she'd quietly changed how people thought about surviving Montana winters. But the people who'd known her remembered. At her funeral, Dale Hutchins' son, now running his father's ranch, told a story about the winter his dad came home convinced that everything he knew about building was wrong. He said Martha taught him that being smart isn't about knowing everything. It's about being willing to learn from anybody, even when they're doing something that looks crazy. Eleanor gave the eulogy. She talked about her mother's stubbornness, her resourcefulness, her absolute refusal to accept that the way things had always been done was the only way they could be done. She didn't set out to prove anyone wrong, Eleanor said. She just wanted her daughters to be warm. Everything else, all the people who copied her, all the ranches that changed how they built, all the families who spent less and lived better, that was just a side effect of her refusing to freeze. The barn still stands. The Quonset hut is still inside it, though no one lives there now. Eleanor kept the property, turned it into a small museum of sorts. School groups visit sometimes, learning about homestead life and vernacular architecture. They walk into the barn, see the curved metal shelter, feel the air gap, and ask the same question everyone asked, did this really work? And the answer is always the same. 20 logs. For days. The worst blizzard in 20 years. Yeah, it worked. There's a pattern in American history that we keep repeating. Someone on the edge, too poor, too desperate, too stubborn to do things the right way, figures out a solution that actually works. The experts mock it. The community dismisses it. Then a crisis proves them wrong, and suddenly everyone's copying what they swore was impossible. Martha Gaines wasn't an engineer, wasn't a scientist, wasn't even particularly educated. She was a widow with 2 kids and a heating bill she couldn't afford. But she understood something that a lot of educated people miss. Old solutions aren't stupid just because they're old, and new solutions aren't smart just because they're new. What matters is whether they work when your life depends on it. The barn within a barn method worked because it followed principles humans have known for thousands of years. Wind protection, thermal mass, air insulation, dead air spaces. These aren't modern discoveries. They're engineering basics that people used to build igloos, sod houses, dugouts, and cliff dwellings long before anyone could explain the physics. Martha just applied them with war surplus and common sense. And here's what's important. You could do the same thing today. Not the exact same method, though honestly, you could if you wanted to, but the same approach. Look at what's expensive in your life. Look at what's wasteful. Look at what everyone knows is the only way to do something. Then ask yourself, is there a simpler way? A cheaper way? A way that uses physics and common sense instead of throwing money at the problem? Because the old ways weren't backwards. They were tested by people who didn't have the luxury of being wrong. Now here's what I want from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced. And if you learned something today, if this story changed how you think about old wisdom and modern solutions, hit that subscribe button because every single week I bring you real survival knowledge that actually worked when people's lives were on the line. The wilderness doesn't care about your degree. It cares about what works. Martha proved that. And so can you. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.